Help defend the church by becoming a supporter of OnePeterFive. Your tax-deductible contributions make it possible for us to continue our work of informing and inspiring the faithful, of rebuilding Catholic culture and restoring Catholic tradition. Make a real difference. Go to onepeterfive.com/donate today.
You're listening to the OnePeterFive podcast.
It is a real joy for us to welcome you all here. Habemus Papam.
Rebuilding Catholic culture, restoring Catholic tradition.
Hello and welcome to the OnePeterFive podcast, episode 43. I'm your host, Steve Skojek, and my guest today is a familiar one, Eric Sammons, a former evangelical Protestant who entered the Catholic Church in 1993. He has been involved in Catholic evangelization efforts for over 2 decades, including in an official capacity at the diocesan level. Eric is the father of 7 children and the author of 6 books, including The Old Evangelization, How to Spread the Faith Like Jesus Did, which is the book we'll be talking about today. His writing on Catholic topics has also appeared at The Federalist, Catholic Answers, Crisis Magazine, and of course, OnePeterFive. His website, Swimming Upstream, can be found at ericsammons.com. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Steve. It's great to be here.
So, the focus of this book is evangelization. In simplest terms, what is evangelization?
Well, I define evangelization as one-on-one personal encounters which challenge people to conversion. And there's really 2 parts of that definition. The first one is the one-on-one personal encounters. I think most people, when they hear evangelization, they think of somebody like Billy Graham. Or if they're Catholic, they think of somebody like Bishop Barron or Scott Hahn, somebody giving these talks in front of hundreds or thousands of people. But really, evangelization is much more of a personal activity between you and your friends, you and your family, over coffee or even over Facebook, but more individually. And then the second part of the definition, I think, is the one that's often forgot, is what is the purpose of evangelization? It's to challenge people to conversion. It's not like some slick marketing campaign, get people to like us, people to buy our product, but it's actually to try to convince people to completely change their lives. And of course, that's a very difficult thing to do, and that's why you challenge them to conversion. But the most important thing to remember here is what the end goal of evangelization is. It's to get people to become Catholic. I mean, that's why we do it. We're not doing it to make friends or to be popular or anything like that. We want literally every single soul on earth to become Catholic. I don't care if they're Protestant, if they're atheist, if they're Muslim, if they're Jewish. It doesn't matter. The best thing for them is to become Catholic. And so that's really what evangelization is trying to literally.
So hold on. So the end result of evangelization is not just eternal dialogue?
Well, that sounds like hell to me, but no, it's not. I mean, dialogue, of course, it's my most hated word these days, I think, when it comes to evangelization, because it's the one that's trotted out there like we're just supposed to dialogue and dialogue and dialogue. And really, what does that mean? Now, the true evangelization does include dialogue. Obviously, you can't have a personal encounter with somebody and have a relationship with them without dialoguing, talking to them, learning what they believe, learning what they think, and sharing with them what you believe, what you think. You can't do it without dialogue, but that's not the purpose. That's the means to the end, and that's not the end. But you're right. And what's happened today is it seems to be the end. We just dialogue with people. That's all our duty is. But that's not what Jesus did. That's not what somebody like St. Francis Xavier did. He went to Asia not to dialogue with them, but to baptize them. And that's exactly what he did. He baptized a ton of them.
Well, I know you make the case in the book that evangelization is not marketing. But in some sense, I think that there is an analogy there. If I want you to buy a product and I don't believe in it, I'm not going to be a very persuasive salesman. That's one of the adages of sales is if you want to sell it, believe in it. Believe in what you're selling. And so, if I'm trying to impress you, I'm not going to take you to my least favorite restaurant. If I want to sell you this widget, I'm not going to tell you, what a piece of junk it is. I don't understand why people who seem to think, it's fine as long as, all religions are essentially good, and if you want to stay where you are, that's fine. Why would those kind of people even bother?
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, because I don't think necessarily they believe in the eternal aspects of it. That's the key difference between evangelization and marketing. Marketing, you're right, there is a relationship there because, in fact, when I was working as a diocesan director of evangelization, and I would like meet people on the street, maybe at a Little League game or something like that, who weren't Catholic, had maybe no religious upbringing, and they asked me what I did. Well, the title director of evangelization means nothing to them. So I would tell them I'm basically like the chief marketing officer for the Catholic Church in this area. And they're like, oh, okay, I get it now. Now, I know that's kind of a crude analogy, but it's somewhat accurate. At least got them to understand basically what I did. But the difference is for marketing, you're just trying to get somebody to buy your soda. Hey, Coca-Cola is better than Pepsi, and here's why. But with evangelization, it's a much more important and eternal thing because what we're saying is, hey, there's a chance you could go to hell for eternity if you don't convert and if you don't follow the teachings of our Lord. And now you don't necessarily lead with that. I mean, often you don't. Sometimes you might, depends on the situation, but you don't necessarily lead with that. But that is kind of the basic point. In fact, I remember I had a professor who told me, who would say that you can't preach the good news if the people don't know the bad news. And so if basically people assume everything's fine, that I don't have to do anything to change, why? Well, there's no good news then. If there's no bad news, there's no good news. If we're all just going to heaven no matter how we act and whatever we do, that's not good news, really. That's just like, there's no meaning in life. Why bother doing anything?
Yeah,
why bother
do
being a
any of
good
it?
person? Why bother, helping your wife with the dishes tonight or anything like that? Because, it doesn't really matter. And so I think, evangelization, true evangelization, the person who's evangelized has to believe it themselves. They have to believe this is the best way to live for me and for everybody else. And more importantly, this is the way that will lead to my eternal happiness forever in heaven and also your eternal happiness in heaven.
How did you get involved with evangelization?
Well, I was an evangelical Protestant, and so what? For those who might not be completely familiar with the term, it's a generic term for Protestant Christians who are basically relatively conservative, but they have this like desire to share their faith with others. They desire other people to become Christian like they are. And that's who I kind of was in high school and in college. And so I would do things like I would go door to door in dorm rooms even, and I would share the gospel, as I would call it. And basically it was an idea was if I can kind of shove this information on you, maybe you'll say the sinner's prayer and you'll be saved and go to heaven, no matter what you do after that. But, I got my victory, and that was kind of evangelization. And you can tell there's both good and bad in that. The good is this desire for people to convert, this desire for people to love Jesus and follow him. But of course, there's a lot of bad in that too, because I hated it actually, because I wasn't comfortable. I'm not that much of an extrovert. I didn't like going up to strangers and saying, hey, read this, say this prayer, and you're in heaven. It was very awkward for me.
And honestly, that's an easy sell. I mean, wouldn't it be great if that's all it took? I've done door-to-door evangelization with Catholic mission groups, and man, it is hard. It's like, here's 2,000 years of rules and regulations that you need to learn.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest challenges of Catholic evangelization is we don't have that. They always say the elevator pitch for selling something. We don't have the greatest elevator pitch. Now, I would say because there's so many fallen away Catholics, we kind of do in the sense that we just try to push them to confession. And so we have this entry point that I think is the best entry point because it's a tangible thing. It's a true encounter with Jesus Christ, and it is the way to salvation. If somebody sincerely goes to confession who's been away for it doesn't matter how long, now they're on the path to salvation. Now that they're freed from their mortal sins and they can be saved. And so we do have that. But back to your question about evangelization. So I've always just had this kind of driving force that, hey, this isn't just something for me, but I think it's better for everybody. So when I became Catholic, it kind of transitioned into, okay, now I want to share Catholicism with other people. The funny thing was in the early 90s, most Catholics never even heard of evangelization really, and they thought I was just a weirdo. I mean, they might still think I'm a weirdo, but they really thought I was a weirdo then. And
Totally different.
Yeah, totally different. Right, exactly. So I mean, really, it's always been just something, as the Protestants say, on my heart that I wanted to do. So.
Well, I mean, I think this is interesting and germane to you being somebody who's writing a book about this, who's doing this at a professional level. I mean, you're a convert, so you had to have been evangelized in some way. What led you to the church?
Well, the funny thing is, it's like, and you'll see in the book a little bit, that a lot of my examples of good evangelization are the Catholics who evangelized me. And the best example I have is my roommate in college. We met through the pro-life movement, and he was my roommate for a couple years in college. He was a Catholic, and he was obnoxious. I mean, he was obnoxious about his faith. He broke every rule that they tell you not to do now. Everything they say, oh, you can't be pushy. You can't say this so categorically. You can't blah, blah, blah. He didn't care. I mean, first of all, he's 21 years old, and, we're 20, whatever we were.
Right.
And
Tact was not at the top of
no,
his
not
list
at all.
of priorities.
I still don't know if it is, but it wasn't then, for sure. And so we would get in these completely almost screaming matches in our dorm room about theological topics, Catholic Protestant debates, and we'd also then yell about basketball teams or whatever because we were college kids.
Because you were guys too.
That's right, because we were guys, exactly. And it just was one of those things where he was so serious about it, and he cared so much for my soul that he wanted me to become Catholic, that he won the war. I mean, I might have won a battle or two here, but he won the war, and I thank God for that. But the most important thing is, he made it very clear that he thought if I wasn't Catholic, that was a very bad thing. That was, I think, the key point, because a lot of the times evangelization, we're so afraid of offending people. And he did offend me, by the way. I was offended often by him. But at the
Did you have a safe space is the question.
Yes, I retreated into my safe space. The problem is we were in the same dorm room. It was very small, and so I didn't have a safe space. Now I'm going to sue him for reparations. But no, I just... The thing is, though, he really did care, and he didn't care if he was offensive about it. And because we were friends, though, a lot of that is because we did have a relationship. I do think it's probably not a good idea to go up to a stranger and be offensive and be
Right.
just obnoxious with them. But we knew each other. We were good friends. He didn't mind doing that, and so I think I think it's a great example of evangelization, because it made me then look into it. If it was this serious to him, then it made me start reading things. And so he gave me this is back when cassette tapes were a thing, and he gave me a cassette tape of Scott Hahn's conversion story, and that was a big deal to me. What's this Protestant pastor becomes Catholic? That's weird. And then he started giving me all the Catholic Answers tracts and This Rock magazine and all that stuff, and I did my own studies and everything, and eventually through the grace of God, it wasn't just an intellectual thing. That was first, but through the prayers of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Rosary, power of the Rosary, then I did decide to become Catholic, obviously.
So this is interesting because, you mention kind of how brazen your roommate was, but you also say that that's exactly the problem that most people have. They don't evangelize because they're afraid of rejection. So how do we overcome that fear?
Yeah, I do think the lack of evangelization is mostly fear, and I think it's mostly fear, frankly, of social rejection. I mean, if you think about it, St. Francis Xavier and people like that, they had to fear being killed. We have to fear we might not get invited to the neighborhood barbecue party next week.
Right.
And by the way, I'm saying this for myself too. I admit it. I'm not always that great. I a lot of times will hold back on saying something I should say because of fear of social rejection. I'll do that online. I'll do that in person. And I just think it's one of those things that we have to. It comes down to when I do it, I realize that I'm putting my reputation, my people's view of me above my love of God, above what God thinks of me. And actually, this reminds me of a story. I went to confession. This wasn't that long ago, and it was at a parish I don't go to. I was just there for a daily mass, and they had confession afterwards, so I didn't really know the priest at all. And I confessed in there that I had not stood up for my faith in a number of occasions where I should have, because I didn't want to be not liked. He literally spent his whole time giving me advice on how basically I shouldn't try to shove my faith on other people. And St. Francis said we should just share our faith by our actions. And I almost was like, I wish I had my book with him, because I'd slide it under the other side to him and say, could you please read this before you give anybody else advice? But that's what we hear all the time is if we just live our faith, it doesn't matter. We don't ever have to say anything. But that's ridiculous. I mean, Jesus had to talk. And so if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for us. But I think ultimately we just have to make an examination of conscience and say, do I love God or do I love the approval of men more? And, for a lot of us, we unfortunately sometimes love the approval of men much more than we love God. And I think I think it could be that simple and come down to that, really.
So is everyone called to evangelize?
I think
then?
yes. I think definitely. I think Jesus called everybody to evangelize. I think it's very important to understand what that means, though, because I think most people, when they talk about evangelization, and you hear like many of the different Catholic organizations and groups when they promote evangelization, it's evangelization for extroverts. And I'm not really that much of an extroverted person, and I know a lot of people who aren't, but I think like my wife is an introvert completely, and but she's a very good evangelizer because really it's not a matter of you have to be able to speak in front of a crowd or be eloquent. You just have to have a relationship with somebody. You love them, and in your love for them, you explain to them the best way to kind of solve their problems. And it's always going to be a Catholic answer. I mean, that is always the best way to solve people's problems, is through following the teachings of the church. And so I think that right there is evangelization. And every single person, unless you're a hermit, has a circle of influence, people they hang out with. I mean, your family, your neighbors, your friends, people at work, whatever the case may be. So you can always be doing things to evangelize, bring people closer to Christ all the time in different ways. And it doesn't always have to be words. I don't like the emphasis now on we're just supposed to act good and people will magically convert in front of our eyes. But at the same time, it is our actions and our words. Usually our actions come first, and that leads us then to explain why we did those actions. And those are the words that are really kind of the true evangelization.
So you're not saying that everybody has to go out door to door. This is more of a personal thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. I do think some people are called to going out, even giving talks or whatever, going door to door, doing things like that. But I don't think that's the majority of people. I think, think about like the stay-at-home mom. She doesn't have to go out and go door to door, but she can be evangelizing a lot. First of all, with her own kids, of course. She can be evangelizing. I mean, like my wife, she gets relationships with like the checkout person at the grocery store. She gets to know them, and like
Right, yeah.
when we lived in Maryland, I mean, they get to know her because she's buying this in bulk. But this guy was at our parish, and we didn't run into him. We were in a big parish at the time, and she got to know him, and he wouldn't always go to mass, and so she would say, hey, you really got to go to mass every Sunday, you got to find a way to get there and things like that. And it was just that was evangelization for her. She's not going to door necessarily to do it, but so I do think everybody should be, at least with the people they encounter day to day anyway, they should be doing things to help those people either become better Catholics or become Catholic.
I have another question about that I want to follow up with. But first, I think that it would be I think it's important. You make some interesting observations in the book about the role of prayer and penance in evangelization work, and I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I decided I have these like what I call the 4 Ps of evangelization. It's like a simple way people can think of what is evangelization. The first one is practicing the faith. And the fact is you're not going to be a successful evangelist, not a very good evangelist, if you don't walk the walk. And it's like you were saying before about marketing people, they have to believe in the product. And so if you don't believe in Catholicism and you're not living it, at least, and by the way, one of the best ways to live it is to go to confession, which admits you don't always live it very well. So you practice the faith. Prayer is the second P. And I do think prayer is also what distinguishes evangelization from marketing as well, because ultimately you can't convert anybody. It's only the Holy Spirit who converts people. You just basically...
When you want that new boat, you pray pretty hard when you're in sales. I'm just saying.
Good point. But you definitely, the fact is somebody's not going to change their entire life, give their life over to Jesus Christ because you have some nice, cute words to say. It's going to be because the Holy Spirit. So you have to be in prayer to do that. The third P is the one that I know just blows everybody away. When I'm on Catholic radio shows talking about this, a lot of times they'll bring this up because it seems like out of the blue to them. And it's penance. And I think this is one that we forget a lot. But if you look at who I consider probably the greatest evangelist ever, greatest Catholic evangelist ever, is St. Paul. If you read his writings carefully, you'll see he talks about suffering and penance a lot. And he talks about it in the context of doing it for those he's reaching out to. It's for the church, for those he's converted, for those he's trying to convert. That's what he's suffering. He is basically entering into the passion of Jesus Christ so that others can be saved. And I thought about that. I think I wrote an article for OnePeterFive about this one time, but Pope Pius XII is what got writing he had, where he said, this is a deep mystery and an inexhaustible subject of meditation, that the salvation of many depends on the prayers and voluntary penances which the members of the mystical body of Christ offer for this intention. Where will you ever hear
It's kind of a terrifying reality.
It is.
Because I don't think many of us are aware of it or even, doing it.
Well, when have you ever heard that from the pulpit, from a bishop, from a pope in the past, 50 years, that
never.
The salvation of others depends on our penances, on our prayers? They'll say that, but they won't say our penances. We just ignore the idea that we need to do, and he says voluntary penances. Yeah, we all suffer things because life, can suck sometimes, and we should offer all that up. But we should actually be having voluntary penances, things we do. And it can be anything from a cold shower to, getting up early to whatever the case may be. I mean, people's health determines a lot of that, what you can do and can't do, fasting and things like that. But the point is that in some mystical way, and the Pope even admits it, like he doesn't know why either. He says this is a deep mystery. We don't really know exactly why it is that our sufferings can help others, our voluntary penances help others, but we know they can. They enter into the passion of Christ, the death and resurrection of Jesus, in order to bring about the salvation of others. So P, the third P of penance, I think is very important. And then the fourth P is preaching. That's the obvious one. You have to actually go out and tell people about the faith, about Jesus, or there's no real point to it. So you got to have that one too. But I think the penance part is the one that I think we often forget when we talk about the new evangelization. Obviously, my book is about the old evangelization, but in the old evangelization, we have to remember penance as well.
So recap those 4 Ps again from the top.
So it's practicing the faith, prayer, penance, and preaching.
Okay. I do want to ask you, actually, because you just mentioned it, about the title of the book. So we hear a lot about the new evangelization. This was a term used by Pope John Paul II. Why did you emphasize this book being about the old evangelization? What is the distinction that you're making there?
Probably the simplest reason is because I think we do most things wrong today. I think because we've forgotten how we did it for 2,000 years, and we want to invent new ways. I don't think John Paul II had bad intentions or even a bad idea. I think he was right when he first called the new evangelization. His point was, we are in a new situation in the church. That is true, in that we now have people who are baptized who have never been evangelized, and often not even catechized. So instead of thinking of evangelization as something you go to another country to do, it's literally you need to do it to the person sitting next to you in the pew. And so that is a different situation. And so it calls for some differences in a new evangelization, as he said. The problem is that term just became completely co-opted by everybody. That basically anything they do, it doesn't matter, it's part of the new evangelization. It's like, oh, I have this cute new marketing trick, I have this nice social media account, I'm doing the new evangelization. That's not really the point, I don't think, of the new evangelization. So I wanted to emphasize that the new evangelization has to be built upon the old. How we've converted so many people for 2,000 years is not all of a sudden invalid. So the fact that you have people in the past who would talk about how, preachers who are now saints, who would talk about how many people are in hell, the new evangelization doesn't mean we can't do that anymore. It doesn't mean that we have to avoid all those topics. It doesn't mean now we only talk about ecumenism and how we should all just get along. To have Rodney King evangelization, we really have to have the old evangelization of, no, we have to bring people to conversion. So that's what I was emphasizing, is I think we've tried to add the new evangelization as it's done in many quarters in the church today. It just forgets 2,000 years of our history, of our tradition, of how we've always done it. That was very successful.
More about the medium than the message.
Yeah.
So actually, you brought something up here that I hadn't originally intended to ask you, but you've mentioned hell a couple of times in just 20 minutes, and that's more than most people ever hear in their lifetime from their parish. And it kind of got me thinking, because there's this popularity, especially we see with guys like Bishop Barron, who have this huge, apostolate, online DVDs, everything. A very popular speaker among conservative Catholics. But, this is a guy who promotes the idea that hell may very well be empty. What is that concept, which, doesn't start with Hans Urs von Balthasar, but he obviously was the one who popularized it in the 20th century. What does that idea that all men may very well just be saved and nobody goes to hell do to the efforts of evangelization?
Well, it destroys them. I mean, really, ultimately it destroys them. I want to make a confession here. I actually have always been tempted towards that view. Not because I think it's true, but because just my natural inclination is I want everybody to go to heaven. I mean,
right. That makes sense.
I mean, it's like when I read that. I mean, because I've read, Hans von Balthasar, listened to Bishop Barron, all this stuff, and I think, I read "Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved" by von Balthasar, and I was like, oh, I really want to embrace this idea. I really do, and I admit, but I look at myself, I say, am I doing that just because it will make me feel good, and it's kind of what I want? Or am I doing this because I think am I kind of looking at this because I think it might be true? And ultimately, it's not true. It's not consistent with the teachings of the church, the teaching of Jesus Christ. And if you, in the book, the subtitle is How to Spread the Faith Like Jesus Did. What I wanted to do was I wanted to look at the model of Jesus Christ, what he talked about. How did he evangelize? How did he share his faith, so to speak? I guess it's kind of a weird way to put it for him. He is the faith. But right. He talked about the devil and hell a lot. I mean, he talked about the need. He resisted him. That was one of his major jobs, so to speak, when he came down, was to defeat the prince of this world, to defeat the devil. And so that is part of the Catholic, the gospel message, is that there is a hell and we're in danger of going to it. And I'm reading Dante's Inferno right now, actually, and oh man, that is just is so politically incorrect.
Yeah, if that doesn't get your imagination
going. And just the way he has, he was just talking to some pope who was head down, buried with his feet, and it was just oh my gosh, he just didn't pull any punches.
The funny thing is, maybe I'm morbid, but I was never able to get through the Purgatorio and the Paradiso. I just started losing my ability to focus. But man, the Inferno had me riveted. Yeah. I was like, this is not a place.
I mean, it really is good to remind you of the reality of hell and how our sins do lead us there without Jesus Christ. But this idea that hell is basically empty, I mean, it's also, it has had a lot of different forms, especially in the last 50 years. The anonymous Christian was very big in the 60s and 70s. This idea that people in Africa who had never heard of Jesus Christ before, but they have these good feelings and good desires. They're an anonymous Christian. Now, there might be some truth to that God in his mysterious ways might do something to bring that person. I don't know. I'm not going to speak for God. I do know, though, however, that taken to its logical conclusion, what it's basically saying is it doesn't matter. Jesus doesn't matter. All that matters is that you're a good person and you basically have good thoughts. And if that's true, then there's just no reason for Catholicism. There's no reason for the sacraments. There's no reason for Mass. There's no reason for any of this if basically that's the case. So why evangelize? And if you look at the rise of that belief that hell is basically empty except for maybe Hitler, Stalin, and people who put up Confederate monuments, then you're basically...
topical.
Yeah, I try. In 2 years, when somebody listens to that, they'll be like, wait, what was that about?
They're not going to know because they're all going to be gone.
True. What's a Confederate monument?
The memory hole has consumed everything.
But I mean, basically, if hell is empty, if you look at that, the rise of that belief, it coincides directly with a decline in true evangelization in the church. I mean, it's a direct relationship, and it makes sense because there's really no reason because it's hard to evangelize. You get rejected a lot. It's not exactly a way to make friends. And so if you do that, why do that if there's really no purpose to it? The guy's going to heaven anyway, so whatever.
And there's a lot of personal feelings on the line. There's a lot of folks out there who had, their Protestant grandmother who died, and they're, you're saying stuff that's making them wonder, well, were they saved? They didn't have the sacraments. I mean, there's a lot of...
Yeah, I mean, my whole family's Protestant. I feel that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and the thing is, that temptation to hope that God is going to be merciful, I think that we all are subject to that, but we know what we have been taught through divine revelation and through the teaching authority of the church, that we know. Anything beyond that, we can ask God to be merciful, we can hope, but we just can't presume.
Right. That's what I always
And
like.
yeah.
I had a relative who's Protestant recently asked me, like, do you think we're all going to hell because we're all Protestant, we're not Catholic? Because I had said something in one of my podcasts about that or something like that. And I said, here's the thing. I know for a fact that I know the way to heaven for a fact. Jesus has made it very clear. You become a member of his church, the Catholic Church. You're baptized, you receive the sacraments, you live a sacramental life, you follow the commandments the best of your ability, you go to confession when you fall. I know if you do that, you're going to heaven. I guarantee it, in fact, because Jesus guaranteed it. I hope if you don't do that, that there's some way that you get into heaven, but I cannot, I can't like speak for that. I have to be silent on that issue because the scriptures are silent about it. The tradition of the church is really silent about that, so I have to be silent about it. I mean, I can tell you what my personal feelings are, but my personal feelings don't really amount to much in the end.
And it's frankly hard enough to do it with the sacramental graces. I can't even imagine trying to do it without it.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point too. Is just that not only are you kind of really skirting, putting yourself in danger if you don't live a sacramental life, you're really just not getting the help you need, because I know that I desperately need the sacraments just to kind of get by. And so if you don't have them, I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, I can barely scrape myself off the floor and get back to the confessional most weeks. So yeah. Oh my goodness. So all right, I want to move into the practical questions, because I think that there are a lot of them, and we'll do them as long as you have time. But one of the big ones, going back to the question of rejection, is how do you evangelize in your family, among your friends, in your neighborhood, your workplace, without just becoming a pariah, without being the guy that, like, you go to get a cup of coffee and everybody else leaves the kitchen,
Right. I think that the first thing is you actually have to love these people and be their friend. I think if you look at, for example, how the church grew in the first 300 years of its existence, we tend to think of like St. Peter's preaching at Pentecost that converted 3,000 people, and that's very much part of it. But if you look at sociologically how it happened, it was much more just people living the Christian faith in their communities, and that was such a witness to others. For example, when a town in the Roman Empire would also have a plague, all the rich people, all the respectable, pagans, they would leave town because they didn't want to get caught. The Christians would come in and care for those people. And they'd ask them, why are you doing this? And they'd say, because you are Jesus Christ to me. I am serving you in serving Jesus Christ. I'm in serving you, I'm serving Jesus Christ. And that had such a powerful impact. When the martyr would go to get killed, and he wouldn't beg for his life, but instead he would proclaim the beauty of the faith, sometimes the people who literally martyred them would then convert. The executioners would then convert because they see that witness. But you notice in those cases, they're not exactly, it's somewhat of an indirect approach if you think about it.
Yeah.
Because they're not, the purpose, they didn't go into town, those sick people, to evangelize them. They went in there to serve them. And in doing so, they evangelized them. When the martyr proclaims Jesus is Lord before he gets killed, he's not doing it thinking, oh, I want this to convert everybody around me. He's doing it because it's a proclamation of faith that he doesn't want to deny his Lord.
But it's also not the same thing as just that apocryphal, statement of St. Francis, preach the gospel of necessary used words. It's more than that. It's the example of living a faith that you believe in so much that you'll do these unthinkable things for it. And that's a different thing, I think, than just being a nice person who makes sure that you recycle and you don't turn down the air conditioning too much and you don't kick puppies and, I mean, I'm exaggerating.
But you're right, because sometimes living the faith means that you tell your niece, no, it's evil to get an abortion. You cannot do that. And you will do anything to stop her from doing that. That is true love. It's not, like you said, it's not just being, because that's exactly what the St. Francis quote is of, just preach the gospel always when necessary, use words. What it's come to mean is just be a nice person, a nice secular person, and that's all you really have to do. That's our commitment. But there will be times where you will do things that will offend other people, and you can't help it because you're being faithful. Like I said, if you had a family member, I found out maybe a niece was going to get an abortion or something like that. If you simply just said, I love you and I support you no matter what, that's evil. And that's terrible what you're doing. You need to do everything you can to stop that from happening. And so, that's, I think, the big difference in because you're doing that out of love, just like the person who went into the plague-ridden town to serve them. You're doing the same thing when you're trying to convince your niece not to have an abortion
And the
today.
thing is, this is a hugely common thing. I mean, I was just talking to somebody recently, somebody I know well and care about, and is a very faithful woman, but she's a mother of a child who has kind of gone astray. And she said something about, I always wanted to be that person who supported my kids no matter what, right or wrong. And I said, but you can't do that. I know that you think that that's a form of love, but if you support them right or wrong, you're tacitly giving them permission or acceptance of what it is that they're doing. And I know that you would never overtly do that, but just that attitude of, I'm just going to support them no matter what. That is not Christian love. Christian love is tough love.
Yeah, and
unfortunately.
that's scandal, really, what it is. You're putting a millstone. You're going to have a millstone around your neck because you're basically leading people into sin, and that's the big problem today. Is we often do that, and you see that with the big hot button issues today. And I think probably homosexuality is the big one right now. Is that you have a friend who's homosexual and they get married, so quote unquote, to their boyfriend or whatever, and do you go to the wedding? Are you supposed to support him? What do you do? And the truth is, of course, you don't go to the wedding because it's not a marriage, and you don't do anything that would support them. And I've kind of come around, become more, I guess the term is hardcore than I used to be. And I think it was from what's the guy's name? He's been on the OnePeterFive podcast before. Joseph
Chambra.
Chambra, thank you.
Yeah.
And I just following him and reading what he has said about this issue. Being a formerly living a homosexual lifestyle and now seeing how destructive that is, to realize that any type of support in which you condone, that basically condones the relationship and says it's just like a regular relationship, that's really leading people into sin and it's supporting the sin. And that's a very terrible thing to do, and it's the opposite of evangelization. And so those are the times where evangelization becomes really hard. And that becomes, it's more than just being nice and having kind of a live and let live attitude. I mean, I'm very supportive of the government having a live and let live attitude, basically leave us alone, but I'm not, as individuals.
Yeah, but that's a different podcast.
That's right, exactly. But as individuals, that's not what we're called to do. When we have a relationship with somebody, we want what's best for them. It's like, it's like the standard kind of example of if you have a friend who's an alcoholic, you don't take them to the bar. And so you don't do anything that would support their drinking habit. And if anybody's in any type of life of sin, you don't do anything that would support it or say that there's nothing wrong with this. And I think that
I think that the more inspiring maxim than preach the gospel, if necessary, use words, is that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Right. Yeah. That's right, because that's a very difficult saying, because the blood, it can be the red blood or it can be the white blood, as they say, the white martyrdom of being rejected, losing friends, losing prestige, losing your job, maybe, all these different things that can happen in life. And I think, maybe we'll even get to a point in society where it means losing your kids, because
which, by the way, all of which is more penance that can be fed back into the system and offered up.
Exactly. Accepting that penance as something that we're uniting ourselves to Jesus. I mean, if we know what happened to Jesus when he preached the gospel, and so if we think we can avoid that, then we're not really preaching the gospel, probably.
Yeah, and I just, as a matter of pragmatism, my wife was telling me that bubonic plague is making a comeback in the United States, so there could be some opportunities for us.
Oh, looking forward to that. See, I'm a big fan of penance and suffering when I don't have to do it.
Right. Yeah, no, it's way better to write about it and talk about it and then go kick back
it's
with
great
a cold
then.
one.
Yeah, That's right.
I'm
Thanks.
with you on that.
Thanks for splashing that water on my face.
So let me ask this question. There's a lot of skills that go into effective evangelization, but is there one thing that sort of rises to the top? What's the one thing people need to be able to have that they can build their other, skill set around, that is just the essential ingredient?
I think, the cliched answer, which is probably a true answer, is a deep prayer life. If you're not praying regularly every day, and the spiritual directors and saints have always suggested at least an hour a day in prayer. And I like to mention that somebody mentioned Fulton Sheen. I'm not too busy for that. He said, well, you should pray 2 hours a day then.
Yeah, right.
And I do think that is essential, because I think what happens when you do that, you gain the strength to say, to be more forthright and have fortitude that you need to say things in difficult situations. You're given more opportunities. I really do think God gives us the opportunities we kind of deserve. And if we continue to flounder and don't take advantage of them, I don't think we get as many. I think he realizes kind of our capabilities. He's just going to be like, well, this guy's not very effective. But somebody who is effective, because they're praying and they're using that, I think they'll get more and more opportunities. I think on a more practical, that's practical, but on a more practical level, I think knowing why it is that you follow your faith. Why is it that you go to Mass regularly? Why do you go to confession? Because St. Paul was the example. He loved telling the story about his life before his conversion. And he told his personal story. And I think really everybody can do that. There's a reason you're Catholic. And I don't think, people love to kind of idealize the converts, like, oh, they converted because blah blah blah. I think the story of the faithful man or woman for their whole life is just as impressive, if not more so. My father-in-law was like that. He was a faithful Catholic from the day he was born till the day he died, and he was very disturbed with the changes after Vatican II. He just kept going to Mass. He kept telling his kids, you got to follow the Pope. You got to, follow, he died in 2005, by the way, but you got to basically, you have to be united to the Pope no matter what. And he had this very simple faith. He prayed the rosary every day. He prayed the sorrowful mysteries every day. He was like, I'm not going for like the other ones. I'm just doing sorrowful every day. And it was just like this.
He was.
Yeah, I was so inspired by that, and this guy was very introverted. He wasn't like one of these kind of flashy guys. But that's a beautiful story that I think can be told, and people can be inspired to be like that. And so there's no excuse for not being able to tell your own story. So I would say learn your own reasons. Like when somebody asks you, why are you Catholic? If you can't answer that relatively easily, then you need to work on that and have that in your skill set, because that will come out in different situations. Because if people are asking, why do you choose to live like this? Why do you choose to have 7 kids instead of the 1.3 that you're supposed to have? You have an answer for that, because you're Catholic. And
because I'm insane and I'm a masochist.
Well,
that's why,
that's the
obviously.
first. Yes, that is very true.
Clearly, we both have 7
Yes.
kids. We're masochists.
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody at my son's baseball practice last night, a new kid on the team, talking to his mom, and I mentioned I had 7 kids, and that always is like the looks you get. Actually, she had 4 kids, and she was very cool, and she was actually more cool than most people are about it, so that was nice. But they still are kind of like, I can't believe it.
I love it. You get these questions, like you go to the grocery store and they're like, are they all yours? And I look at them and I say, no, I borrowed extra kids because it's so fun to go shopping with.
I know.
Because they always keep their hands to themselves and don't climb on anything.
Yeah, I just like having them. Now I have mostly girls, so mine's a little bit more controlled, I admit. So it's not as bad.
Yeah, but the teenage years, again,
Exactly.
Another podcast. We'll get to that one another time. So, do we need to take a different approach, do you think, when dealing with fallen away Catholics rather than those who've never been a part of the church?
I think the fallen away Catholics, I've always, like when I was a diocesan director of evangelization, that was my main focus, was fallen away Catholics. Because I honestly looked at them as the low-hanging fruit. I thought, okay, these people, they have some attachment to the church already. They're baptized, so that's the most important attachment. But often they have a cultural attachment. I think you can use that to your favor. I think that often the tradition of the church, and when I say the tradition of the church, I mean the kind of fullness of that tradition, the liturgy, the architecture, the music, all of that. My honest opinion is I think that those type of things are initially off-putting, but long-term some of the best ways that you can bring people back to the faith. Because I think, like, for example, the Latin Mass is an example. I remember the first time I went to a Latin Mass. I was a practicing Catholic. I was, totally into my faith. This was like probably only about maybe 12 years ago. I completely was like unimpressed. I didn't even realize the priest, it was a low Mass. I didn't even realize the priest had started until like 12 minutes into it. I was just completely, I thought people were just kneeling because they were praying still.
I had a very similar experience my first time. Yeah.
So it was like, And people take that to mean, okay, that means it's bad evangelization. I mean, I've written an article, people can look it up at OnePeterFive, about how the Mass's purpose is not evangelization, but there are side effects to the Mass of evangelization. But my point here is that things like that, like the great tradition of art and music in the church as well, I do think because our culture has become so bad, so degraded, that I do think the initial reaction of a lot of people to things like that is initially negative, that they don't recognize the beauty of it because they've been completely bombarded with all this crass culture and terrible things in our culture today. But I do think those traditional things speak to the human person on a much deeper level. And so I think the open-minded person who's willing to give it a chance, which is really, evangelization isn't going to work if the person's not open-minded about things like this. Yeah. I do think that person will eventually become come to appreciate the Catholic faith and hopefully then practice it more in depth. So, and that's the problem. My biggest challenge as a diocesan director of evangelization and evangelization in general is when somebody has shown some interest, I don't want to send them to the local parish.
So I was going to ask you this, and I'm really glad you're bringing it up, because this comes up a lot with people that I talk to. They don't know. So, they evangelize people, and then they don't know where to send them, and they're worried that the people are going to actually be interested in converting, see the mess we're in, and just, feel like they were sold a bill of goods.
And it's a real issue. I mean, you can't downplay it. My best friend from high school is Protestant. We were Protestants together, and I converted, and he didn't. But he became very interested in Catholicism over the years, and he lived in a diocese that was, shall we say, was not ideal. And I knew the parishes around him were not very good, and I really struggled with that, because sending him to one. In fact, he went to a Catholic parish a few times, and he came back and told me how basically. He's like, that's not really Christianity. And he told me what the pastor said, and I'm like, you're right, that's not. Because it's basically, the typical homily of be nice and everything is fine.
The new Beatitudes that don't mention God.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was it's a real issue. And I think ultimately what we do is a couple things. We really seek out the parishes in our area or in the area where the person lives that are living the faith. I'm a believer. You go to the parish where the faith is being practiced as fully as possible. Mm-hmm. I drive, almost 30 minutes to our parish, and we probably pass a dozen parishes on the way. And they're varying grades of, one or two aren't that bad, but they're still, I don't want to raise my kids in them. And I think we just have to recognize that's the reality today, that in very many Catholic parishes, the Catholic faith is not really being taught and lived. And if we try to send fallen away Catholics there, or even Protestants or whatever there's a really good chance it's not going to be effective, because especially, let's be honest, especially if it's a guy we're talking about, because it's so emasculated now. Your typical parish, it's just so unattractive initially. Whereas if you go to a parish that has this beautiful architecture and music and art and things there, you're going to be a man and a woman definitely will be attracted to that kind of naturally over time. Like I said, they might initially be off-put because they're not used to that. They're used to playing video games or whatever. But I think they will eventually be attracted to that.
But you can play video games and still like
yes.
it. This is the thing. I think that, don't you think that because the world is so crass and that we're so exposed to this, lowbrow everything, that's exactly the argument for why that isn't what we should experience when we walk into the church?
Here's the thing. Let's take a step back and look at it again on marketing terms, kind of like if we were a company running a business. What is it the Catholic Church is good at that distinguishes it from the rest of the world? And that is things, just from on a surface kind of human level, that is things like music and art and architecture, those things. That's what we're good
Greatest patron of the arts in human history.
So why don't we focus on that and kind of keep that as like our main selling point, because that distinguishes us. Because I always say that if we're basically if our parishes are basically no different than like society, why would anybody bother to join our parish? Why not just sleep in on Sunday morning and become, and watch, the news or MTV or whatever? You see that in Protestant churches.
Yeah, because if you're going to walk into the church and get pop music, you get better pop music at home.
And it's always better. And if you go into the Catholic parish and you get your, 1970s ditties that they're playing. Nobody's attracted to that. You see that in the Protestant world too, that the churches that are the most hardcore kind of preaching the gospel as best they understand it in a more direct way, and they're really kind of being countercultural, they're usually the most popular churches as well. Whereas, and so I don't get why we try to conform to the world, because it just ends up it's just from a sales technique standpoint, it's dumb. And so
There's this billboard I saw on the highway about a week ago, and I can't remember exactly what it said. It was an ad for one of these Protestant, rock and roll churches, and it said something like, "Are you bored?" And it did it in the text grammar. It was like, "Are you bored?" And then it said, "You're only 30 minutes drive from a great time." And then it was like whatever the church was, and I was like, that is the worst. Like, I would never go to a church for a good time. That's just not
it's
even in my concept of why I would go to a church.
And the funny thing is that the world's laughing at those people. I mean, they're not attracted to it at all. And that's why they're laughing at the Catholic Church often, is because we're so desiring to be hip and cool. And the funny thing is, of course, our hip and cool is defined by what was hip and cool in 1972. It's like a big fail, but yet we have this great great tradition, the great patrimony of the arts. I'm a big believer that on a kind of institutional level, I mean, I talk a lot about personal evangelization in the book, but on an institutional level, I think what I think, when you walk into a church, like when I walk into a Catholic church that's celebrating the Latin Mass, has all this, the smells and bells, or an Orthodox church, that has something like that, my first thought is often, these people really believe this bleep. And it's like, I don't know if I should bleep on your podcast, by the way. That's why I said that. I didn't know if you had an automatic 5-second bleeper, so I just did my own.
No, but I mean, we can do amazing things in post-production.
There we go. But no, really, it's like I walk in and I think to myself, like, these people may even be wrong, but boy, they really are sincere and they believe it. Whereas when I go into a typical kind of suburban Catholic parish, I don't get the sense that they really believe it. I get the sense it's all kind of like a nice social group, and it's something to do on Sunday morning because that's kind of what we've always done.
And you look around and you kind of find yourself going, why is everyone here?
Right.
Why did you get up for this?
Why is there anybody here? Usually there isn't.
I would never get up early for this, or even late.
Yeah, it's just
I would just not. I would be having brunch somewhere.
And that's what most people are doing. Is they are not getting up. They're going and having brunch somewhere because they recognize that intuitively. Those of us who are Catholic, kind of live our faith, we can see through that and know, okay, there's a mass here, there's the sacraments, and it's vitally important. But it's for the regular person who doesn't have that kind of background, they just see a bunch of jokers who just have nothing better to do on Sunday morning, so they just get together and sing some bad hymns.
So we talked about dealing with fallen away Catholics. Let's talk about the opposite end of the spectrum. What's a good starting place for evangelization when you're dealing with a friend or a family member who is at best agnostic? I could go to the atheist route, but I mean, I give you an example, not necessarily hostile. My father-in-law is from China. He lived there till he was 14, came to the United States without his parents, kind of went through his whole life without ever having been raised by someone in a faith. He has a sense of some benevolent force in the universe. He thinks it's the original ancestor with his name, who's buried at the top of the mountain back home, and he's like, the OG. But I mean, he has no cultural or spiritual context for hearing the gospel. So what's a first step for approaching people who are starting with pretty much zero common ground with us on the faith?
I think really there is something to be said for the Catholic Church has such a great tradition of human wisdom, of reason. Thomas Aquinas is one of the best when it comes to just recognizing the human person and how we live, and things that a good-natured person, I don't care what their upbringing is, they recognize because it's part of our being. It's natural law. I think that is a great way to start, because if we show that the church has thought about these issues of humanity, because the biggest problem I think in our country especially is all Christians are tagged as kind of fundamentalist, Protestant fundamentalist. If you're a believer, that means you reject reason, and you're just like this person who just I'm losing the name of it.
Like a young earther.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody who just like, if God said it, that makes it true. not the idea that there is truth that is built into the world, so to speak. God can't even contradict it. And, God can't make a rock so big he can't push it. That's just nonsensical.
My dad used to ask me that question in the car when I was a kid. He made me cry.
That's
I
nice.
was like, I don't know the answer.
I think you're going to need some therapy for that, Steve. I love reading Frank's sheet on that, and he has some great writings on that. But really, though, these are questions. These are answers to questions that have been raised by humanity, by men and women for centuries, no matter what the religion is. And I think that is a common ground that we can start with and show that, hey, the Catholic Church, the reason for, like abortion, for example. The reason we're against abortion is because of the dignity of human life. And if we show how radical we believe that, like we really do believe in the dignity of all human life no matter what, well, for an older person, that might be very comforting because we're like, we ain't pulling the plug on you because we don't care how much you are a quote-unquote burden to us. We recognize your dignity and we'd never do that. You see that with the defense of marriage. That we believe the reason that we seem so cold-hearted about marriage is because we really do recognize this bond and the importance of family structure for humanity, the importance of a child having a mother and father in the home who are united to each other, how that every social science study has shown that's what's best for children. So these are things that are kind of they're before faith. And so I think though it shows that the Catholic Church, that our faith has allowed us to see these things more clearly. And I think that's probably the best starting point for people like that, is showing these different stands we take on moral issues and issues of that nature are because of we understand how the human person works. And we understand how the human person works because the Holy Spirit has helped us to see that.
So it's less about being preachy and more about understanding what the moral principles are behind what we're preaching.
Yeah, I think so. For people who have very little common ground with us, that should lead eventually, if you're doing it right, to discussions of faith. Because I think that it's like, yes, you could come to this knowledge of these things by reason alone. You can come to knowledge of God, the existence of God by reason alone. You can come to knowledge of natural law by reason alone. However, because of original sin, we typically take detours and we don't come to those conclusions.
Right.
And so it's because of faith that we're able to come to these conclusions and really stick to them and realize this isn't something just a cultural thing that all life has dignity. Instead, it's an underlying principle of who we are as humanity.
So, we have more complex situations in a way now than maybe Christians have ever faced. As an evangelist, how should we respond to the unique circumstances of the modern world? So I'll give you a really weird but true example. Recently, I needed to have one of my appliances repaired, and the warranty company sent somebody over. But when he showed up at the door, he was a she. I'm 6'2", big guy, long hair, makeup, other aftermarket feminine enhancements.
Okay, so he was actually a he. I just want to make sure we got our pronouns right. Okay.
There was no question that he was a he, but he was trying to transform into a she.
Okay.
Is there even an opening in a situation like that? I kind of recognized, because I got a phone call ahead of time, that something was off. When you get a phone call from a dude and he says his name's Rachel, you're like, this is weird. So I sent my kids upstairs and I was like, but I didn't slam the door in his face because I'm like, okay, this is a human being. He's here to perform a service.
Right.
I'm not really sure where, I'm not often dumbfounded, but I was. and I was just trying to figure out, it's the larger question of tact. What role does charity play in evangelization, especially when the other person is hostile and flaunting this alternate worldview? He was perfectly professional and polite, other than the fact that nothing made sense about the fact that he was showing up at my door that way.
Yeah, I think, first of all, we never, ever compromise our principles. Like, you wouldn't call him she.
Right.
That is not true, and that would be a lie, and we're not supposed to lie. And so you would never compromise your principles in that sense. You would also never do anything to endorse that behavior. Like, if you knew the guy or something, you wouldn't do anything to endorse that situation. And I think, though, like in that specific situation, he like you said, he's a person performing a service. People will come and, your cable man might be a Satanist for all you know.
Right.
And you're not like, you don't know that. This is just a very public thing.
You don't have a vetting every time somebody comes to do
Right,
something.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing wrong with doing business with in these type of situations, because that's just kind of part of what it means to be human. Is we deal with people all the time. We're not, we're sinners too, so we're kind of in the lot with them. We're not publicly proclaiming our sin as good, but at the same time, neither was that guy at that moment. He was just simply kind of walking around doing his job. And I think though, but I think it depends on kind of situation. When it comes to like publicly, the public square, that's where we have to be basically willing to go to the cross, I guess is the most appropriate analogy, is, and never compromise the fact, never give in and say this is okay. It's never good to call somebody who's a man a woman. It's never good to say two men who have a relationship together are married, because that's not married. That's not marriage. It's never good to say a baby who's killed in the womb. That's just, there's nothing wrong with that. Those things we have to always be. In individual situations, like family situations, where we have a family situation, well, that in the we still never compromise and say something is right that is wrong, but we might have different interactions with the person. And so it's not like we have to cut them off from our lives. But what we don't do is, and this is like the example of, let's say you have a son who is now quote unquote married to a guy. You don't have any obligation to invite them to Thanksgiving dinner as a couple, because in a way what you're doing is you're saying it's okay to be like that. And so I think that would be a mistake, and I think that would be a problematic at best, because what you're saying, you're telling that person, your son, you don't have to feel uncomfortable with this relationship with me, with me as your parent, but they should feel uncomfortable with you. If my child was doing something that was wrong, I'd want them to feel uncomfortable about it in front of me and not be able to proclaim it like it's no big deal.
Right.
And then you do that with the balance of always saying that I love you, you are my son, you'll never not be my son, and I will always support you in what is best for you. That's the difference between like the support's my right or wrong. No, I support you in what's best for you. People make mistakes. If they make a mistake, you still love them, but you don't support that mistake and continue it on and say there's nothing wrong with that. You say, okay, what can we do to fix that mistake? What can we do to move forward and to now live back in a grace-filled life? So I think, but you're right, it's becoming weirder and weirder, and it's becoming more and more in our face. And I do think at the rate we're going, there'll come a time where if you don't acknowledge falsehood as truth, then there will be potentially serious repercussions. And I think like probably the most scary one is the idea of kids being taken away. If a homeschooling family decides they're not conforming to this, or a kid a family sends their kids to a school and the kid mentions at school that, I don't think Johnny is actually Sally, then all of a sudden he's taken away from your family. And these are type of things we just have to pray and that just might be what our cross is in our life.
And I think we have to find some way to be ready for this. I mean, I wasn't ready for that situation. I've gone to the coffee shop and had the barista be a guy who thinks he's a girl. I've not ever expected to have them show up at my door to fix a broken refrigerator. It's just not.
Yeah, and
I wasn't ready to provide some kind of witness, and I couldn't find the context. But as these things start happening more and more, it's like, what is our obligation in those moments? Because this is a soul that's been put in our path.
Right.
And how do you do that when you're in the middle of a business transaction? It's a very strange thing.
It is. And I think we have to recognize kind of our obligations are based upon our relationship with the person. And I talk about that in the book some. The obligations of a priest, for example, to his parishioners is different than my obligation to a stranger walking on the street next to me.
Yeah, you can't do fraternal correction if you don't have a fraternal relationship with
Exactly. And I think that's the key. And so I don't get bent out of shape if, for example, if I was in that situation and I didn't say anything to the guy, it wouldn't bother me really. If he brought it up to me in some way to kind of promote it, and I didn't say anything then, that would be different. That would be different. Now, if he was my brother-in-law or something like that, I guess, well, how would that work? Anyway, if he was a relative, sorry, I was like, wait a minute, how would that?
Suddenly the terms.
I know. If he was, a relative, then I have a different relationship with them. If you're
Yeah.
a kid, I have a different relationship with them. So I think it all depends on the kind of the situation, and I think the deeper relationship you have with somebody, the more obligation you have. Like your spouse, for example, if they go by the wayside, you have a huge obligation to do everything you can. In fact, that's your calling, your vocation is to bring them to heaven. So you would do everything you can. A godparent, for example, has a huge obligation to that. Now, godparents should just be willing to say anything to try to help their child get to heaven, and not care about anything other than that. So I think you have to know all of those different kind of permutations, so to speak.
So I think this dovetails with something that you wrote about in the book, which is this idea of we have to make people feel welcome. Was Jesus welcoming? Is that our job?
Oh, I can never decide if dialogue or welcome is my most hated term. I mean, it's like
Don't forget accompaniment.
Oh, that's a new one, and oh my goodness. But the welcoming thing, I have worked as a diocesan director of evangelization. I work with parishes a lot, and I've worked in my own parishes, and you hear that's the key term. They say we just need to be welcoming. They believe if the parish is welcoming, like they have good ushers or something like that, then people will just flock to them. And it's this belief, it's this myth of the big, meanie Catholic Church of the past. That basically, if you walked into a Catholic church in the 1950s and you weren't like basically St. Therese, they would scream at you and they would beat you and all that. I mean, that's basically what people seem to think these days, which of course is just ridiculous. And so the idea, though, is like if we just are welcoming to people, then somehow they'll like us. And if they like us, they'll become Catholic or they'll practice their faith. But why would I completely change my entire lifestyle just because I think Johnny's a cool guy? That's not going to happen. I have to think that, wow, his way of living is so much better than mine, and it really would make me a better person and give me a better outlook in life, all these things. That would be why I would want to follow him and do what he's doing. And so welcoming becomes like the end all be all of many parishes. And that's not real. And if you look at Jesus, he actually, I remember Frank Shee was the one, I read a book by him, I think it was To Know Jesus Christ. And he basically was the one who kind of first brought this in my head. If you read the Gospels objectively, kind of like take yourself out of your knowledge of them when you read them, you'll look and you'll see Jesus actually isn't that nice a guy. He doesn't praise hardly anybody. I mean, he praises every once in a while. He praised John the Baptist once, and I think he's the Canaanite woman once. He kind of was like, graze your faith. But in general, he's very direct. He's very blunt. And at times, he's a big fat meanie. And it's like, that's who we're supposed to model everything after. I mean,
I'm glad you said this because I've often thought, this isn't a guy that I would be like super excited to get to know based on, my reading of this. I feel like I would be in trouble.
That's the thing is, and that's because the thing is, the Jesus of today, the image of Jesus that most people have today, the Father James Martin image of Jesus, is that he's just this nice guy who wants everybody to just get along, be happy, be tolerant, and just be nice to people. And that has nothing to do with the Jesus of the Gospels. And in fact, if you look at how Jesus treated the religious leaders of his day, especially, oh my goodness, I mean, he was a big jerk. I mean, by the standards of today. And it's like,
right.
That's why I never have a problem. I mean, I have less of a problem being kind of rough on social media with priests and than I do with lay people, even though I know that sounds counterintuitive. We're supposed to respect priests, and I think we should. And there is a certain their holy orders give them a certain kind of rights and privileges that they deserve and earn and all that. Well, not earn, but you know what I mean. But at the same time, Jesus was much harsher to religious leaders who led people astray. And so when somebody like a Father James Martin leads people astray, I don't see there's any reason to hold back on that person, because that is exactly like the Pharisees and Sadducees of Jesus' time. But he didn't just do it to those. I mean, that's our other image. Like, okay, it's okay then to condemn like the Pharisees. And of course, the Pharisees are always the right-wing people somehow, even though they were the ones who were liberal on divorce and things like that.
Right,
but
exactly.
More importantly, look at like the picture on the cover of the book is the Jesus encountering the Samaritan woman at the well. Look at that one and read that one carefully. People have this idea of this being this kind of nice, beautiful scene of this woman, and he leads her to faith and all this, and they talk about baptism and water that gives life, and But if you look at it, what he does is he leads her from a discussion of natural things to supernatural, which that's a great model for evangelization. But then when it looks like it's time, the woman is thinking about, hey, I might follow this guy. This guy seems to know what's going on. He says, go get your husband. That is basically equivalent of a priest today saying, to somebody who comes to them who's been married 3 times without any annulments and saying, basically, you got to go to confession and you got to get these marriages taken care of. You're living in sin. It's the equivalent, because he knew she didn't have a husband. He knew her past irregular marriage situation, as we call it today, and he confronted it directly. And if that happened today, she would write a letter to her bishop and complain about this terrible person, and then he would get sent to re-education camp and told, you're not allowed to say things like that. But that's who Jesus was, though. Why? And the thing is, why do you do it? He did it because he's loving. I mean, I'm kind of joking when I say he was a jerk and all this, because obviously he wasn't. He loved her, and he knew the only way that she could be truly free from the bonds of sin and become who she's meant to be would be as if she left that sinful lifestyle that she's always lived. And so that is very applicable for today. So when we have all these people who are divorced and remarried without an annulment, it's not us being mean to say you can't receive communion. It's us being loving and saying you're never going to have that fullness of life that God wants you to have unless you get this situation taken care of. Like, stop living with this person, live, brother and sister, whatever the case may be, it's different.
Well, you made the analogy earlier of taking an alcoholic to the bar. It's the same thing. You don't give a diabetic, sugar. You don't do these things just because they want them. Love means actually looking out for their best interest.
And I've seen a lot of times people they assume that the result of that, of confronting them, will always lead to them rejecting the faith and rejecting person. However, in my life, I have seen that is just not true. Some of our good friends that we're friends with down in Florida, they have such a wonderful story. The woman grew up Catholic. The man was Protestant. She kind of fell away from the faith in college. They got married in a Protestant church, and they went about their business. And then at some point, she decided she wanted to go back to the Catholic Church. So the husband was like, okay, that's fine. They started going to Catholic Church. She would receive communion. He knew that he couldn't, but she would receive. Well, one day, a priest gave a homily. A priest at her parish she respected gave a homily that basically said, if you're not, it said it in such a way that she understood she wasn't in a valid marriage because she got married outside the Catholic Church as a baptized Catholic.
Right, okay.
And so she was shocked by this. And so she met with him and said, what is going on here? And so he had to tell her, you're not in a valid marriage because of, your situation, so you should not receive communion. You know as well as I do, a very large number of priests would never do that. But she took it to heart, heard that, and she stopped receiving communion, kept going to Mass, and just kind of prayed about it and thought about it. And then eventually she got her marriage regularized in the church, became a faithful Catholic, raised her kids faithful Catholic. And the best part of the story is about 10, 15 years later, which was just a few years ago, the husband became Catholic. And part of the reason he became Catholic was because he was so impressed with the church's insistence on the sanctity of marriage and on what marriage really is. And so it's not that we assume that, if we say the kind of the mean thing, that means they're going to reject us, they're going to reject the church, they'll never become Catholic, and it's all done. Well, you're basically saying God, there is no grace and God can't work. And I've seen that it's absolutely not true. Yes, some people will reject it, but it's so beautiful when somebody comes to that realization and then converts and it's because in this case now a whole family with all the kids are living in the faith. They're a beautiful Catholic family, all because that priest was willing to step out and say to her, you really do need to take care of this situation, just like Jesus would.
I think that actually is a great place to end it. I know that you have to run. The book is The Old Evangelization, How to Spread the Faith Like Jesus Did, and it's available now. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast with me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
All right, Eric, thanks.
Okay, God bless. Bye.
You've been listening to the OnePeterFive podcast. This has been a production of OnePeterFive Incorporated. Copyright 2017, all rights reserved. Please remember to visit us online at OnePeterFive.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to support our work at OnePeterFive.com/donate. Thank you for listening.